Hello and welcome to our video presentation on disaster housing made of light gauge steel. In the following minutes, I will talk about what is a disaster house, what is a disaster area, what is light gauge steel, what are the existing solutions and the alternatives, and in the end, what is our own solution in case of an emergency. So let us first find out what is a disaster house. A disaster house, also called an emergency shelter or post-disaster shelter, is a place for people to live temporarily when they cannot live in their previous residence due to natural or man-made disaster. Such houses are usually provided by the government or an organization. There are different types of disaster shelters, like emergency shelters, in the form of tents for example, and transitional shelters, which can be made out of vast variety of materials like timber, bamboo, plastic, steel, and so on. The difference between these is mainly their lifespan, the quality of the material that has been used, and of course, how fast and easy it can be built. Let us now find out what is a disaster area. A disaster area is a region which has been heavily damaged by either natural, technological, or social hazard. Natural disasters include tornadoes, hurricanes, floods, volcanic activity, and earthquake. The technological hazards are usually man-made and include nuclear incidents and radiation. Social hazards that create a disaster area are riots, terrorism, and war. We will now look into a couple of examples of disaster areas. The first one is Hurricane Katrina. Hurricane Katrina is known as one of the deadliest and costliest hurricanes in the history of the United States. It formed over the Bahamas on August 23rd, 2005 and made landfalls mainly in Cuba, Florida, Louisiana, and New Orleans, causing 1,835 deaths and a total damage of over $108 billion, destroying millions of homes on its way, flooding the entire city of New Orleans, leaving over 3 million people without electricity. The storm is being referred to as probably the worst catastrophe or set of catastrophes in the country's history. A June 2007 report by the American Society of Civil Engineers indicated that 2/3 of the flooding were caused by the multiple failures of the city's flood walls. The disaster area has been estimated to be as big as 230,000 square kilometers, which is almost as big as the United Kingdom. Nowadays, only 30% of the low-income neighborhoods residents have returned, as opposed to 90% in the rest of the city. Much of the rental housing in the city was destroyed and never rebuilt. 4 years after the storm, rents were nearly 40% higher than they were before Katrina. Our next example is the Syrian civil war. The so-called Syrian uprising is an ongoing armed conflict which takes place in Syria. It all began in the spring of 2011 with a nationwide protest against the Bashar al-Assad's government. The conflict gradually turned from a protest into an armed rebellion to the extent where chemical weapons were used. The violence in Syria has caused millions of people to flee their homes. As of September 2013, more than 6.5 million refugees have been displaced internationally, living in camps. 1 in every 3 of those refugees is seeking safety in Lebanon, with a default population of 4.8 million people. Due to the huge amount of refugees living in Lebanon, the camps are on the verge of collapsing. Our next example is the Izmit earthquake. This earthquake occurred in Izmit, Turkey, on August 17, 1999, with a magnitude of 7.4. Even though it lasted only 37 seconds, its impact was huge. Some sources suggest that close to 45,000 people were killed, while officially the figure is 17,000. Approximately 500,000 people were left homeless. Over 120,000 poorly engineered houses collapsed, leaving people buried below the debris. The area has been known for being in high risk of earthquakes, and thus the construction of buildings with more than 2 stories was illegal. Unfortunately, many buildings with up to 6 floors were built nevertheless, which led to their easy collapse during the earthquake. Nowadays, the building laws there are very strict so that such disaster never repeats itself. Next is the Moore tornado. In May 2013, a tornado struck the town of Moore, Oklahoma, USA, with peak winds of 340 kilometers per hour. It killed 24 people and injured 377 others. An estimated of 1,150 homes were destroyed and $2 billion in damages. After an inspection conducted by structural engineers, it was stated that there were some malfunctions in the buildings which may have led to their destruction. The Moore City Council proposed a measure making 12 changes to its residential building codes. Included require that new home construction in the city include hurricane clips or framing anchors, continuous plywood bracing, and wind-resistant garage doors in order for homes to withstand winds up to 135 miles per hour. And thus, Moore became the first city in the United States to adopt a building code addressing the effects of tornadoes on homes, which exceed the national standards set by the National Association of Home Builders. A year later after the event, the disaster area is rather empty. There isn't much that has been rebuilt since people aren't coming back there. Next is the Pakistan floods. The floods in Pakistan, which began in July 2010, were the result of heavy monsoon rains. About 1/5 of Pakistan's land area was under water, approximately 800,000 square meters. More than 20 million people were affected by the natural disaster, mainly by destruction of property and infrastructure. The total death toll was close to 2,000 people. The total economical damage might have exceeded $43 billion. Our next and last example is the Haiti earthquake. The catastrophic earthquake in Haiti happened on 12th of January 2010, 25 kilometers away from its capital, with a moment magnitude scale of 7, followed by at least 52 aftershocks. The exact figure of the victims is not certain, but it is anywhere around 100,000 to 300,000 people. It has been estimated that 250,000 residences and 30,000 commercial buildings had collapsed. In the nights following the unfortunate event, most of the people slept on the streets, in their cars, or just anywhere out in the open, either because their houses had been destroyed or because they feared it might get destroyed due to the many aftershocks. The construction standards are extremely low in Haiti. The country doesn't even have building codes. Structures are raised anywhere they can fit. Some are being built on slopes with insufficient foundations or steel supports. Nowadays, the situation hasn't improved completely. After the disaster, 1.5 million people lived in camps, 279,000 of which still continue to live in those camps. Only a very small amount of the funds which were raised to help was used for permanent housing, only 215 million. Most of the funds, 1.2 billion, was spent on short-term solutions, tent camps, temporary shelters, and year-rent grants. The temporary housings are no solution. 50% of them have no functioning toilets, many of them are in constant risks of flooding. To today's date, only half of the debris after the quake have been cleared out. The next thing that we will talk about is light gauge steel. So, what is light gauge steel? It is cold formed steel shaped by guiding sheets of steel through the series of rollers. Each roller is changing the shape and making the flat sheet of steel into C, S, U, and L sections. The thickness of the steel varies between 1 and 3 millimeters for structural sections, and between 1 and 2 millimeters for non-structural sections. The steel is coated with zinc or with mixture of aluminium and zinc. The thickness of the coat depends on the environment in which it is used. Since light gauge steel is a very light material, which reminds a lot of timber structures, it is a good solution for a shelter following an earthquake, because lighter weight structures are less likely to cause fatalities than collapsing masonry structures in future earthquakes. On the other hand, though, light gauge steel is probably not the best solution for a post-hurricane location, since it is more vulnerable to strong winds. Nowadays, it is more preferred than wood because it costs less, it has a rot and termite resistance, it is easy to work with, and it doesn't require any special equipment. Another advantage is its strength, which gives it a long lifespan. Light gauge steel is easy to form in different shapes, to carry the components, and it can be insulated by a large range of materials. It is also non-combustible, but fire protection should be provided because it loses quickly its strength in fire. So what are the existing solutions for disaster shelters? Let's look into a couple of examples. In 2002, in Democratic Republic of Congo, the Goma volcano has erupted and affected the city of Goma. After the disaster, 15,000 houses were destroyed, which is 20% of the local housing. 5,000 families were supported with shelters and packages. Each shelter costed $250. The shelter design was based on the cheap and easy-to-find local materials. The size of the houses was 21 square meters. The average household was up to 6 people. The shelters were made by plastic sheeting, the roof is made by zinc sheets. Most of the components of the house are made by timber. The construction is with wood framing and the floor is made by concrete. Another example of an existing solution are the steel frame shelters which were built in Indonesia after a tsunami disaster in 2004. The structure consists of a cold-rolled, hot-dip galvanized steel frame with a pitched roof of 24.3 degrees and a raised floor. The shelter kit presents a good design solution that is appropriate in areas vulnerable to high seismic loading, although minor alterations are required for wind loads. It took a total of 2 days for construction, and the expected lifespan of the structure is a minimum of 5 years. Except for many already existing solutions available, there are also some prototypes and innovations which deserve our attention. For example, this one. This very innovative emergency house is meant to be very modest in scale and material expenses, and thus is a very easy and fast solution to be built on-site after emergencies. It is also convenient because it can be pulled along by a person or by a car and even hitched to a bike. So, what is our own design? Since every context is different, the shelter design must also be adapted accordingly to each location, response, and project because what is good in one situation is not necessarily the solution to another. With that being said, let us now make up an exemplary situation and build a transitional shelter accordingly. Transitional shelters can support people affected by a disaster between the emergency and the time when they will be able to build or rebuild long-term housing. If the transitional shelter is well designed, the materials can be reused for the long-term housing. Before building a transitional shelter, there are many things which need to be taken into consideration. The most important of which are safety, cost, material availability, timelines, size, number to be built, construction skills, and many others. So let us imagine that our project is to design a shelter for a post-earthquake situation in Turkey. Earthquakes are fairly common in Turkey, and as we saw from our real-life examples from the previous slides, they can be extremely devastating. The shelter will be built with a life expectancy of at least 3 years. It is important to choose wisely the site location. In our case, it should be away from any fault lines and it should not be near riverbeds, coastal areas which have sandy soils, and near high water tables. The covered living space of each shelter will be 20 square meters. The height from the ground level to the eaves, 2.55 meters, and 3 meters to the ridge. Light gauge steel will be used as a material for the framework, since it is light and easy to build, and it is a good material to use for a shelter in the case of an earthquake. The structure should be easy for installation, so that it can be built in no more than 2 days, and it also has to be cost effective. There will be a total of 6 rectangular reinforced concrete pad foundations, to which there will be fixed columns using base plates and 4 bolts per plate. The structure will have a mono-pitch roof and a suspended floor, which will be supported by additional stub columns resting on base plates directly on the soil. The structure is not expected to be exposed to any strong winds. The average wind velocity in the area is 5 meters per second. Bracing has been installed in the walls to provide lateral stability. As a conclusion, I would like to say that in case of a disaster, emergency shelters are of an extremely high significance. It is important to provide shelter for people as fast as possible, but we should also remember to think about the future and about the permanent housing, and thus, money should be spent wisely on the temporary solutions. The main part of the funds should be invested into the permanent solutions. And so, this was the end of our presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.